Jumpin In on Manx Radio.
With Howard and Chris Kane.
Hello.
Good evening.
And welcome. And hello once again on a Friday evening here, Manx Radio. The best in modern and contemporary jazz is this week. Jumping in with myself, H.
And me, Chris. Yes, welcome along to this week's Jumping In as November comes to a close. We're still recovering from a fantastic London Jazz Festival and starting to think about what might make it into our pick of the year, as more new releases are still tumbling into our inboxes. So, H, any thoughts on what might make the cut for you this year? And have you brought any likelies with you today? Or like me, are you still trying to give new possibilities their first outing?
Well, both, and there's far more music than I can listen to. As for your first question, yes, I have. It's a new old one. Keith Jarrett, The Old Country, more from the Deer Head Inn, one of my possible all-time favourite Keith Jarrett sessions. I've been enjoying that on repeat for the last week, so several weeks to be honest with you. It's all about the piano trios, as I say. Our friends at Storyville sent us one from Michel Petrucciani, the much-missed magician of the keyboard we had the pleasure of seeing several times, although sadly never got to interview, live at the Café Montmartre in 1988. And whilst I'm staying with pianos, it's all been about, and we haven't actually, I don't think, celebrated Bud Powell's centenary, Tempest Fugit. It's a set I don't think I've ever got round to listening to, really, but yeah, 100 years of Bud Powell, my word.
Fantastic. And for me, we're bogged down, we're hanging high, we're wedging a couple of Danes in, and to start we shout, Hey Lalo, or Hey Lalo, with the Airmen of Note. Hey Lalo, I decided on. I think it's named for Lalo Schifrin, taken
right, yeah.
from the 46th album, can you believe, from the United States Air Force Band, founded back in 1950 to honour the tradition of the late Glenn Miller. The band has some of the top players in the services, and this 2024 Jazz Heritage Series release, I think this is the third one we've had from them, is no different. The servicemen certainly know how to swing, and that track, Hey Lalo, was original penned by one of the band's guests on this session, trumpeter John Faddis. I always used to think of him as being a young Turk, but no, at 71, probably he's not. But he's still blowing just as well as ever, as we heard on his solo. We also heard a great solo from trombonist Matt Hooter. Hootwer. Very strange name. And if you enjoyed this track, then the album won't disappoint. The album is just called 2024 Jazz Heritage Series from the Airmen of Note. And it's out now. I'm sure Glenn Miller would be pleased.
It would be very fine sound, and yes, how many albums did you say? 40-something albums?
46.
Ridiculous,
Yeah.
Absolutely ridiculous. I don't know how many albums Michel Petrucciani brought out in his lifetime, or how many have been published since he sadly died, I think back in 1999. But there's a new one hitting the racks pretty much as we speak, I think thereabouts. Thanks to our friends from Storyville. It's the Michel Petrucciani Trio, Jazz Club Montmartre, 1988, and featuring a rarely recorded trio with, as it turns out, on drums, the then obviously probably only in his mere 70s or 80s, and just died at 99 just a week or two back, Roy Haynes at the kit. Not often that Michel Petrucciani played along with Gary Peacock on the bass, now sadly no longer with us either, and Roy Haynes at the drums. There was just a short studio meeting, I think, in 1987 to record half of Michel Placed Petrucciani, where it had separate trios. One of them was that trio. And the European tour in 1988, where there was a single recording by the German radio SWR in Karlsruhe in July, which I think was released as well. And then this concert in Copenhagen on July the 3rd, which featured 6 original compositions by Michel, and finds him on fine form. Here he is playing tribute to another one of his piano heroes, Keith Jarrett, with a track he simply called Mr. KJ. Mr.
Thank you.
KJ.
Roy Haynes on drums.
It was indeed. Who was on bass?
Gary Peacock on bass.
I thought it might have been the Michel Petrucciani trio at the Jazz Club Montmartre in 1988 with, yes again, Michel piano, Gary Peacock bass, Roy Haynes drums. Sadly, none of them with us anymore. Like I said, we were privileged to see him, I don't know, 2 or 3 times at least, I think, over the years. Never got to get an interview with him. And as it says in the liner notes, his sort of appearance on stage would always, people think, oh my goodness, because particularly in latter years, he'd be carried on. He had a terrible brittle bone disease, and in the latter years, he couldn't even walk on, so he'd be carried on by his manager, seated at the piano stool. He had to have blocks, because he was only 3 foot something tall, to reach the piano pedals. And then when the music started coming out of him, he thought, oh my goodness. And apparently his fingers would break sometimes because of the disease he had, which robbed his life far too early in 1999. It's, I think, late 30s, I think he was, or somewhere along those lines. But from all accounts, a very cheerful chap who made the most of every minute and celebrated life. And a fantastic talent he was as well. Great to hear him playing there. And he played with pretty much you name it, before his death in 1999. It was January the 6th, 1999. As it says, the years in between were a musical orgy of summit encounters. Kenny Clark, Clark Terry, Aldo Romano, Lee Konitz, Charles Lloyd, with whom Charles Lloyd came out of retirement, of course, because he was so impressed with the talent of this young Frenchman. Wayne Shorter, Jack DeJohnette, Dave Holland, Tony Williams. The list goes on and on and on. There are so many great albums out there, and this will add to the canon of wonderful recordings. The Michel Petrucciani Trio in Montmartre in 1988. It's a double CD set, pretty much out any time now, I think, and it's on Storyville.
Very nice indeed. Yes, he used to play with such energy. He'd be hoisted high on the shoulders of his bandmates at the end of every set. Fantastic. Next from me, a new ECM release from the trio of Swiss pianist Colin Vallon. I must admit, it's only recently I came by his music, and this is the 4th ECM release with his trio. Samares, which means salt marsh, is also the name of the album, and this is also the name of the track. Samares, the title track from Swiss pianist Colin Vallon and his trio of bassist Patrice Moret and drummer Julian Sartoris. This is really a close-knit unit. Vallon, I think, fits well into the ECM canon of less is more and often allows notes to hang precariously in the air before equally valuable silencers. And the cohesive nature of the trio's overall sound perhaps is not that surprising, as Vallon and Moret have played together for 20 years, and the current trio with drummer Sartorius has been a unit for 10 years, and they maintain a regular schedule of 2 gigs at least per week, so their empathy, I think, is to be expected. What's changed since the last release, Dance, in ECM in 2017? Well, more than you might think, as Vallon has now expanded the trio's vocabulary with the use of treated piano with small blocks of wood stuck between the strings and on the hammers, and subtle electronics, almost imperceptible at times. These changes, I think, they only serve to enhance their presence. Not one for the car, but the trio are providing an original voice in what we know is a very competitive sector. Definitely on my list to catch them live sometime.
Indeed, fascinating stuff. You're listening to Jumpin' In with Chris and myself, H, here on Manx Radio. Don't forget, of course, we alternate with our sister programme, Sweet and Swing, where I bring you some of the best from the big band years, nostalgia, big band swing from the 20s, 30s, 40s, maybe up to the 50s on a lucky day. And in something what's becoming a bit of a piano fest this evening, and sticking with ECM as well for something I've really been enjoying of late. I've always enjoyed Keith Jarrett, I must admit. More is trio work than solo work, if I'm honest, although the solo work is very fine, but the trio work just adds extra dimensions. I just think brings more to my ears, certainly, particularly obviously the Standards trio. But also another trio where he played often with Paul Motion in his American quartet, but in trio not that often. And a wonderful set which was released many years ago by ECM called At the Deerhead Inn, recorded in September of 1992. I really enjoyed, which actually had Gary Peacock again. We've heard a second outing from him this evening, and Paul Motion on the drums this time. Well, only in the last month or two, they've gone back to the tapes. Apparently, Jarrett had been talking to Iker and said there was more of that recordings recorded live at the time at the Deerhead Inn. They went back to the tapes and they thought, yeah, it warranted bringing out some more. So they brought out a second set. More from the Deerhead Inn, it's subtitled The Old Country, and named after one of the tunes actually contained within. And, well, yeah, frankly, you never know with album 2 and these things, do you? Is it just sort of the remnants from the cutting room floor? And the answer is a definite no in this case. Every bit as good as volume 1 in my book. Let's hear the trio on Golden Earrings. Wonderful stuff from the Deer Head Inn. Keith Jarrett with Gary Peacock bass, Paul Motion drums, just been released on the ECM label. More from the Deer Head Inn, after, like I said, that album which was released back in the 1990s, I think it was, from the recordings made in September of 1992. And it harks back to the fact that it's one of the very first places, the Deer Head Inn. It's only a smallish place, you might gather there, not like the big halls that he might be used to playing later on in his career, but it's always ran a jazz policy, and he'd had a job as a shipping clerk, apparently, he said, and he'd just graduated from high school, says Keith Jarrett, and one of the first gigs he has, it was at the Deer Head Inn, the first serious trio job on piano, and it's retained a place for jazz lovers for over 40 years. I think the room stayed the same as well, a bit like the sort of the Village Vanguard or something, so he loved the idea of going back to play after some 30 years, and he hadn't played with Paul Motion, the drummer there, for some 16 years. He said it was like a reunion and jam session at the same time. The evening was warm, humid, rainy, foggy, autumn in the Pocono Mountains, and the room full of people, with more outside on the porch listening through the screen doors. My friend Bill Goodwin offered to make a documentary recording. When I heard it, I said, this has to be released someday. You can hear what jazz is all about. Totally agree with that. Check it out. If you like the first one, you'll love the second one.
You know, with any of these great pianists or any of the great trio players, not only do you hear the empathy between the players, but you hear the sheer joy that they have after it. Could be it Keith Jarrett or Kenny Barron or indeed Oscar Peterson or many before. But fantastic stuff. Next from me, a track from the latest release from trumpeter and composer Brian Lynch, whose big band I think I've featured on the show a couple of times previously. His new album is called 7x7 by 7, which Brian says was his lockdown project. 7 musicians, 7 pieces, all lasting 7 minutes. Here's the high point of the hang. Yes, indeed. Very nice music. The whole album, I think, is arresting. 7 times 7 by 7 from Brian Lynch, and that was the high point of The Hang. Brian Lynch's
Didn't
release...
hear any hang, it must be said. Didn't hear any hang.
Well, no, I don't think it's... I think The Hang as in like hanging, how you... as opposed to hong, which is how you pronounce the hang percussion instrument. Hung. Yes, well, hung. But we have the tenor saxophone in the septet of Craig Handy, Alex Wintz, well-known guitarist, pianist Luis Perdomo, bassist Boris Kozlov, and drummer Kyle Swan, with percussionist Murph Ocamp, and of course Brian Lynch on the trumpet. And the album's released on Brian's own label, Holistic Music.
Great stuff. I'm going to take you back a wee bit now because I've been listening to clips of a series on BBC Radio 3 celebrating the fact that it's 100 years since the birth of the great Bud Powell, the pianist, and again, sort of flawed genius, without a doubt a genius on the keyboard, introduced in many ways the modern keyboard sound in jazz. Great friends with Thelonious Monk. Apparently they'd just sit at the keyboard together for 4 hours at a time or more, just talking, playing ideas and such like. But again, he had all sorts of demons to contend with outside the brilliant music. We'll just concentrate on the wonderful music for now, and I thought it'd be lovely to hear a little bit to celebrate how much he did. I don't think we'd have that modern jazz keyboard sound if it wasn't for Bud. We'll go back to 1949 in New York. Bud Powell's Modernists. Bud on piano, Fats Navarro trumpet, Sonny Rollins tenor sax, Tommy Potter bass, Roy Haynes drums. Second outing for Roy this evening. A track called All God's Chillin' Got Rhythm. How you get all the notes into the space, I'm not quite too sure, but that's the way it was with bebop back in the day. Wonderful stuff, it has to be said. Bud Powell's Modernists, as I say. Fats Navarro trumpet there. Sonny Rollins, we just heard on tenor. Bud Powell, of course, at the piano, Tommy Potter bass, Roy Haynes drums. New York, 1949, 100 years old this year, Bud.
And that just about wraps it up for this week's show, but there's time for a track from Denmark's Sveinborg Kardib. Sveinborg Kardib, what a great name. Actually, it's just made up of compromising keyboardist Nikolai Sveinborg and drummer Jonas Kardib. We'll leave you with the title track of their latest release, Super Killin', and we'll see you in December. Amazing.
Indeed, almost Christmas.
Take care.